Yes everyone, welcome back to the Halloween Stories series with me. I'm really glad you enjoyed the last one. The story of the Chupacabra seemed to go down really well, but now we're going to go a little bit of a different direction. This week on Halloween Stories, we are going to be talking about a very famous Scottish serial killer, and he goes by the name of Dennis Nilsen. So sit back, relax, and prepare to be very creeped out by horrendous crimes in the story of Dennis Nilsen. Let's go. Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in a town in Aberdeenshire called Fraserburgh. Nilsen was a necrophile and a serial killer and murdered at least 12 young men and boys between the years of 1978 and 1983. Apparently Nilsen had a pretty tough upbringing. His parents were constantly fighting and the person he was really closest with was his grandfather. Nilsen was reported to be a quiet but adventurous kid. However, after the death of his grandfather, that all changed. After the death of his grandfather, he became a lot more quiet and reserved, would often spend his time alone down at the fishing docks looking at boats. A few years later, Nilsen would discover that he was gay, which at some stage was really hard for him, and he would do everything he could to try and hide it. As a way to escape, Nilsen joined the British Army Cadets at the age of 14 and then would eventually join the army. Apparently when Nilsen was in the army he was a very good academic, however the physical aspect of things he wasn't so good at. However, Nilsen did say that being in the army was the happiest years of his life, as he loved to travel and then just loved the day-to-day army duties that he had to do. According to reports, Nilsen had his own room when he was in the army, which really allowed him to discover what his real sick fantasies were. He was posted around the country for 11 years when he was in the army, but eventually left the army in 1972. In 1973, Nilsen would move to London and would intend to join the police force down there. However, he missed the companionship and comradeship that he had in the army and would eventually spend most of his nights drinking alone by himself. This is when Nilsen would often start to go to gay pubs, and this is where his horrendous acts started. So as I've mentioned before, Nilsen's acts apparently took place between the years of 1978 and 1983. He's been done on 12 counts of murder for young men and boys, but apparently he has confessed to even more than that. Most of his victims were gay, homeless men. However, he did meet some heterosexual men in places like public transport. He even met one victim outside his own house. All of his murders took place in one of two North London addresses where he was living at the time of his life. He would often coax him into the house through the temptation of alcohol, or if the victim was homeless, the offer of shelter. His victims would come inside his house, they would be given a drink, maybe some food, and then Nilsen would proceed to strangle them with a rope. However, if strangling them didn't work, Nilsen often resorted to drowning them in the bath or with a water bucket. Now this is where things really start to get disturbing. Nilsen would keep the bodies in his home for weeks or even months before he would eventually dismember them. Each victim that was killed between 1978 and 1981 in his Cricklewood residence was burned through bonfire. And the victims that were killed in 1982 and 1983 kept at the other address were actually kept in his flat, and their bones and their flesh were flushed down the toilets. And Nilsen did apparently admit to masturbating over the dead bodies that he'd collected. Now Nilsen's murders were discovered by a Dino Rod employee. He goes by the name of Michael Catron. There was apparently a horrific smell coming from Nilsen's home, and he went round to investigate, only to find flesh and bones were clogging up his drains. Upon this, he would then go and call the police, to which two police officers would decide to stand outside his house and wait for Nilsen to come home from work. When he did, one of the police officers would approach him and say that they heard a complaint about the smell coming from his drains, and they would like to investigate. The police officer would go into Nilsen's house only to discover the smell of rotting flesh. This is where Nilsen would go on to admit his crimes by telling the police officers that the remains of the bodies that he had killed were kept in 2 plastic bags in his home. The officers would go on to arrest Nilsen for murder, and when they took him back to the station and asked how many, Nilsen apparently said 15 or 16. The police would spend months culminating just who it was that Nilsen killed and trying to count up the names and inform the families of what he had done. And then Nilsen was eventually brought to trial on the 24th of October 1983 for 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He was trialled at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to every single charge. Nilsen was then sentenced to life imprisonment, however the judge did recommend that he serve at least 25 years in jail. And then Nilsen would spend the rest of his life in jail until his death in 2018. Dennis Nilsen is up there with one of the most horrific serial killers in British and certainly Scottish history. There has been countless shows and documentaries reporting the crimes he did. There was even a show that came out a few years ago on Channel 4 called Des, and the one and only David Tennant played the horrific serial killer. A truly vile and disgusting human being, and we pray that there's never anyone like this ever again. And that is the story of Dennis Nilsen. Hopefully I've opened your eyes to him a little bit. If you knew who he was, please do comment. I hope I've done a good job of telling his story. But if you didn't, then there you go. Make sure you leave this video a like. If you don't, just leave a dislike or do nothing. Again, we don't see it. So what's the point? What is the point? You're just being mean. Don't. Be kind. Make sure to subscribe if you are new, and we will catch you on the other side. I'm not even going to attempt it. Take care, brush your hair. Bye!